$100? The CEO laughed. That's not a car. That's scrap metal with wheels. 5 days later, she would wish she had never said those words. The late afternoon sun hung low over Sterling Motors auction yard just outside Charlotte, North Carolina, casting long golden shadows across rows of abandoned vehicles waiting for their final destination. The air carried the scent of warm asphalt, old rubber, and faded memories. Most people came to the yard searching for bargains. Others came looking for parts. Very few came looking for hope. Ethan Walker came because hope was all he had left. At 42 years old, Ethan knew what it meant to lose things. He had lost his wife 7 years earlier. He had lost the engineering career he once loved when medical bills swallowed every dollar he had saved. He had lost the house where his daughter Sophie had taken her first steps. But somehow, through all of it, he had never lost his dignity. And that quiet dignity was worth more than anything money could buy. Ethan adjusted the worn baseball cap on his head and walked slowly between the auction rows. His faded work boots crunched against gravel. Beside him, 10-year-old Sophie held a notebook filled with sketches of classic cars. She never went anywhere without it. "Dad," she said softly, pointing toward a row near the fence. "That one looks different." Ethan followed her finger. At first glance, it looked like nothing special. The paint had almost completely disappeared beneath rust. The tires were flat. The windshield was cracked. Most buyers walked past it without even slowing down. Yet something about the car seemed strangely familiar. Ethan stepped closer. The sunlight caught a small section of metal beneath decades of grime. He narrowed his eyes. "You see it too?" Sophie asked. Ethan nodded slowly. "Maybe." Before he could examine it further, a burst of laughter echoed across the yard. Expensive heels clicked against concrete. Several executives followed behind a tall blonde woman dressed in an immaculate white business suit. Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Motors. The woman who had inherited one of the largest automotive companies in America before turning it into a billion-dollar empire. Her confidence entered every room before she did. Victoria noticed Ethan standing beside the rusted vehicle and smirked. "Thinking about buying that?" she asked. Several employees glanced over. Ethan remained calm. "Maybe." Her smile widened. "For what? Yard decoration?" A few people laughed. Ethan simply looked at the car again. Victoria folded her arms. "That thing's been sitting here for years. Nobody wants it." Sophie tightened her grip on her notebook. Ethan noticed, but kept his voice steady. "Sometimes people miss things." The executives exchanged amused looks. Victoria shook her head. "Trust me, there's nothing to miss." Ethan crouched beside the front fender. Beneath layers of rust and dirt, he noticed a tiny shape barely visible near the edge of the metal. It was gone almost as quickly as he saw it. Just a glimpse. Just enough to make his heart pause. $100, the auction manager announced. "That's the minimum bid." Ethan stood. The crowd watched curiously. Victoria smiled as if she already knew the punchline. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded $100 bill. "I'll take it." The laughter came instantly. Loud. Confident. Certain. Victoria laughed harder than anyone. But as Ethan accepted the title and Sophie stared at the forgotten machine with wide eyes, neither of them noticed the tiny emblem hidden beneath the rust. An emblem that had disappeared from racing history more than 50 years ago. The old pickup that Ethan used to tow the car rattled gently as it rolled down a quiet county road outside Charlotte. The sun had almost disappeared now, painting the horizon with shades of amber and deep blue. Sophie sat in the passenger seat watching the rust-covered vehicle bounce slightly behind them on the trailer. Most people would have seen junk. Most people would have seen a mistake. But Sophie had inherited something from her father that no school could teach. She knew how to look twice. "Dad," she finally asked, breaking the silence. "Did that lady really think you were crazy?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe." Sophie frowned. "I do not think you are." Ethan glanced at her and felt something warm settle in his chest. Through every hardship, every long shift, every unpaid bill, moments like that reminded him what mattered. "That is because you know me better than she does," he said. By the time they reached their small rented property on the outskirts of town, darkness had settled across the fields. Their home was modest. A weathered one-story house with a detached garage that Ethan had slowly converted into a workshop. The paint was fading. The roof needed repairs. But it was home. And home was enough. Ethan backed the trailer into the driveway, while Sophie jumped out carrying a flashlight. Crickets chirped in the distance. A cool breeze drifted through the trees. Together they carefully unloaded the car and rolled it into the garage. Under the fluorescent lights, the vehicle somehow looked even worse than it had at the auction. Rust covered nearly every panel. Dust coated every surface. Decades of neglect seemed trapped in every inch of metal. Sophie walked around it slowly. Still looks kind of cool. Ethan laughed quietly. You are definitely my daughter. He grabbed a bucket of warm water and a stack of old shop towels. They began cleaning small sections one piece at a time. Not because they expected miracles. Simply because respect begins with effort. An hour passed. Then another. The garage filled with the smell of soap, old metal, and machine oil. The radio played softly in the background. Somewhere around 9 o'clock, Sophie suddenly froze. Dad. Ethan looked up. What is it? She pointed toward the driver's side fender. There. Ethan walked over. At first he did not see anything. Then Sophie shined her flashlight at a specific angle. A small shape appeared beneath layers of grime. Barely visible. Almost completely hidden. Ethan's expression changed. Carefully, he wiped away another layer of dirt. The symbol became clearer. Not a manufacturer logo. Not a dealership mark. Something else. Something much rarer. Sophie stared at it. What does it mean? Ethan did not answer immediately. His pulse had started moving faster. Years ago, before life changed direction, he had spent countless nights studying automotive history. He remembered old magazine articles, forgotten photographs, racing stories almost nobody talked about anymore. And somehow, that symbol felt familiar. Very familiar. Ethan stepped back and looked at the car again, this time not as a mechanic, but as a student of history. Suddenly details he had ignored earlier began to stand out. The shape of the body, the placement of the vents, the unusual proportions hidden beneath years of damage. Pieces that should not have existed together. Pieces that did. Sophie watched her father carefully. You know something? Ethan folded his arms. I am not sure yet. But you think something is different? He nodded slowly. Very different. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. Inside the garage, the old fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Neither of them noticed the notification appearing on Ethan's phone across the workbench. A video clip from the auction had just been uploaded online. And at that very moment, thousands of strangers were beginning to laugh at the man who had spent $100 on what they believed was nothing more than rust. The next morning arrived with a pale Carolina sunrise spilling across the workshop windows. Ethan had barely slept. Long after Sophie had gone to bed, he remained at the old workbench surrounded by automotive history books, yellowed magazine clippings, and a laptop that looked nearly as tired as he felt. Every few hours he returned to the garage, staring at the strange emblem hidden beneath the rust as if it might suddenly reveal its secrets. By 7 o'clock, a fresh pot of coffee sat beside him while morning birds chirped outside. Ethan enlarged old photographs on his screen, comparing tiny details. The shape of a vent, the curve of a fender, the location of a badge. One by one, impossible pieces began fitting together. Sophie appeared in the doorway wearing pajamas and carrying a bowl of cereal. Did you stay up all night? She asked. Ethan smiled. Not all night. She raised an eyebrow. That means yes. He laughed quietly. Maybe a little. Sophie sat beside him and looked at the computer screen. Dozens of grainy photographs filled the display. Most showed race tracks. From decades earlier, men stood beside unusual vehicles. Crowds filled grandstands. Dust hung in the air like fog. What are we looking for? She asked. Ethan pointed to one photograph. See this? Sophie leaned closer. The image showed a car partially hidden behind several mechanics. Only a small portion of its front end was visible. It kind of looks like ours. Ethan nodded slowly. That is what worries me. Sophie frowned. Why would that worry you? Ethan leaned back in his chair. Because if I am right, then our car should not exist. The words hung in the room for a moment. Outside, a pickup truck passed on the road. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet inside the small workshop, something extraordinary was beginning to emerge. Ethan opened another document. This one contained old racing records. Most were incomplete. Some had missing pages. Others ended abruptly without explanation. It was as if someone had erased part of the story. Then he found something unusual. a reference to a prototype vehicle developed in the late 1960s. The project had been canceled before public release. According to official records, every example had been destroyed. Every example except one. Ethan stared at the screen. Sophie watched his face carefully. Dad, he swallowed slowly. There was supposed to be one survivor. What happened to it? Nobody knows. At that exact moment, his phone buzzed on the desk, then buzzed again, and again. Notifications poured in one after another. Ethan picked it up. Hundreds of comments flooded a video clip from the auction. The footage showed him handing over the $100 while Victoria Sterling laughed. Millions of views had already accumulated overnight. Thousands of strangers had opinions. Biggest waste of money ever. That car belongs in a scrapyard. Someone save that poor kid from her father's decisions. Sophie saw the comments and quietly looked away. Ethan noticed immediately. Hey. She turned back toward him. Do not read those. But everybody is laughing. Ethan rested a hand on her shoulder. People usually laugh when they think they know the whole story. Sophie studied his face. And do they? Ethan glanced toward the garage where the old vehicle sat beneath morning light filtering through dusty windows. The emblem seemed almost clearer now. More confident somehow. Like it had been waiting decades for someone to notice it. No, Ethan said softly. I do not think they do. Then his eyes drifted toward something he had overlooked before. Near the lower edge of the passenger door, hidden beneath layers of corrosion, was a small metal panel that did not belong there. It was almost invisible. Almost. And suddenly Ethan had the unmistakable feeling that the car was still hiding something far more important than anyone imagined. By late afternoon, the small workshop felt different. The air itself seemed charged with possibility. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating floating particles that drifted lazily above the old vehicle. Ethan had spent most of the day examining every inch of metal, every bolt, every unusual detail that did not belong. The mysterious panel near the passenger door remained locked tight, but its presence alone raised more questions than answers. Sophie sat cross-legged nearby, sketching the car in her notebook while occasionally glancing up at her father. Have you figured it out yet? She asked. Ethan shook his head. Not yet. But you are close. He smiled. Maybe closer than yesterday. Before Sophie could respond, Ethan's phone vibrated again. Then continuously. The notifications had become impossible to ignore. Overnight curiosity had turned into a full internet spectacle. Millions of people had now seen the auction video. Ethan opened one of the trending posts. There was Victoria Sterling standing beside the rusted vehicle, laughing while cameras rolled. The caption read, "The $100 disaster." Hundreds of thousands of reactions followed. Some mocked the car. Others mocked Ethan. A few even created jokes and edited videos that spread across social media faster than anyone expected. Sophie looked uncomfortable. Why do people enjoy being mean? She asked quietly. Ethan thought for a moment before answering. Sometimes people confuse confidence with character. Sophie nodded slowly, though she was not entirely sure she understood. Across town, Victoria Sterling sat inside the glass-walled executive office atop Sterling Motors headquarters. The Charlotte skyline stretched behind her. Multiple screens displayed financial reports, interviews, and market data. Yet one screen held her attention more than all the others. The auction clip continued gaining views. Her assistant entered carrying a tablet. The video passed 12 million views. Victoria smiled. People love a good joke. There is more. The assistant handed over the tablet. Several automotive forums are discussing the vehicle. Victoria barely glanced at the screen. Let them. Some collectors seem interested. That caught her attention. Victoria frowned slightly. Interested in what? Nobody knows. They are debating the emblem. Victoria rolled her eyes. Collectors find mystery in everything. She dismissed the concern and returned to her schedule. To her, the matter was already over. A struggling single father had purchased junk. The internet laughed. End of story. But while Victoria moved on, Ethan kept searching. As evening approached, he finally decided to remove part of the interior paneling near the hidden compartment. The screws were heavily corroded. Decades of dust filled the narrow spaces. It took patience. The kind of patience built through years of repairing things nobody else wanted to fix. Sophie held the flashlight while Ethan carefully loosened the final fastener. A soft metallic click echoed through the garage. Both froze. Did you hear that? Sophie whispered. Ethan nodded. Slowly, he pulled on the concealed panel. At first nothing happened. Then the compartment shifted slightly. Dust drifted into the air. Time seemed to slow. Another gentle pull. The hidden section opened just enough to reveal something inside. Not money. Not jewelry. Not spare parts. A weathered leather envelope sat untouched in the darkness. Sophie stared wide-eyed. How old do you think that is? Ethan carefully lifted it out. The leather felt dry and fragile. Years of silence seemed trapped inside. His hands suddenly felt heavier than before. Some discoveries change what you know. Others change everything. As Ethan opened the envelope, a folded photograph slipped free and landed on the workbench. The moment he saw the image, all the color drained from his face. For several seconds, neither Ethan nor Sophie spoke. The photograph rested on the workbench beneath the fluorescent lights while dust continued drifting through the air around them. It was an old black and white image, its edges worn from decades hidden inside the compartment. A racetrack stretched across the background. Crowds filled the grandstands. Mechanics stood along pit road. But none of that was what captured Ethan's attention. His eyes remained fixed on the car parked at the center of the photograph. It was the same vehicle. Not similar. Not inspired by it. The exact same car. Sophie leaned closer. That is ours. Ethan nodded slowly. Yes. How can you tell? He pointed toward a unique body detail near the rear quarter panel. Because that modification only appears here. Sophie stared in amazement. So somebody raced it. Ethan swallowed. Somebody important. Beneath the photograph lay several folded pages covered in handwritten notes. The ink had faded but remained readable. Ethan carefully unfolded the first sheet. Names, dates, track locations, engineering specifications, test results. The deeper he looked, the more impossible the story became. According to the notes, the vehicle had never been intended for public release. It had been part of an experimental racing project funded by a small, independent manufacturer that disappeared decades ago. Most historians believe the entire project failed. Yet the documents told a different story. One page contained lap times that outperformed many legendary race cars from the era. Another included engineering sketches years ahead of their time. Sophie watched Ethan's expression change with every page. Dad, he barely looked up. This was not a failure. Then what happened? Ethan turned another page. His brow furrowed. The answer was not there. The story simply stopped. No final report. No explanation. No ending. Just silence. Almost as if somebody wanted the truth forgotten. Outside, evening settled across the neighborhood. Porch lights flickered on. Distant dogs barked. The ordinary world continued without realizing that history was slowly waking up inside a small garage. Ethan photographed every document and began searching archives online. Hours passed. Sophie eventually changed into pajamas and sat beside him with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Together they followed one clue after another. Most searches led nowhere. Some produced fragments. Then shortly before midnight, Ethan found a name that appeared repeatedly throughout the documents. Daniel Mercer, the lead test driver, a talented racer whose career seemed to vanish overnight. Ethan clicked article after article. Very little information existed. No major interviews. No Hall of Fame recognition. No detailed records. Yet older racing forums occasionally mentioned him with unusual respect. One comment stood out. The fastest man nobody remembers. Ethan read the sentence twice. Then 3 times. Sophie yawned. Was he famous? Ethan stared at the screen. Maybe he should have been. His phone suddenly buzzed with a new notification. Not another joke. Not another mocking video. This time it was a private message. The sender's name meant nothing at first. Then Ethan opened it. His heart skipped. The message came from a respected automotive historian with hundreds of thousands of followers. The words were brief. Where did you find that car? Ethan read it again. A second message arrived moments later. Please tell me it is real. Then a third. If the serial number matches what I think it does, you may be sitting on one of the most important lost vehicles in American racing history. Ethan looked toward the garage. The old car remained silent beneath the lights. Rust still covered most of its body. It still looked worthless to anyone passing by. Yet for the first time since bringing it home, Ethan understood something important. The value hidden inside that machine had never been measured in dollars. It was measured in truth. And somewhere out there, someone else had just started looking for it too. The following morning began quietly, but the internet did not. By sunrise, the photographs Ethan had shared with the automotive historian had spread far beyond a handful of collectors. Enthusiast forums exploded with speculation. Vintage racing groups debated serial numbers. Retired engineers compared archived records. Every hour seemed to bring a new theory. Yet despite the growing attention, Ethan remained exactly where he had always been, inside his modest workshop with a cup of coffee cooling beside him and Sophie eating pancakes at the small kitchen table. Fame had arrived at his doorstep, but responsibility arrived first. He wanted facts, not excitement, not rumors. Facts. Shortly after 9 o'clock, a call came from the historian. His voice carried the excitement of someone who had spent decades searching for a missing piece of history. I spent half the night reviewing archives, he said. You need to hear this. Ethan switched the call to speaker so Sophie could listen. I am listening. Papers shuffled on the other end. Daniel Mercer was not just a test driver. He was considered one of the most gifted racing minds of his generation. Sophie looked up immediately. The historian continued. People thought he would become one of the biggest names in motorsports. Then he disappeared. Ethan frowned. Disappeared how? Nobody knows. Official records simply stop. No farewell interview. No retirement announcement. Nothing. The silence that followed felt heavy. Some stories, and naturally, others feel unfinished. This one felt unfinished. Before Ethan could ask another question, a second notification appeared on his phone. Then another. Then another. Requests for interviews. Offers from collectors. Messages from journalists. Some wanted photographs. Others wanted exclusive access. One collector even offered $200,000 without seeing the vehicle in person. Ethan politely ignored them all. Sophie noticed. That is a lot of money. Ethan nodded. It is. Then why not sell it? He looked toward the garage. Because I do not think this story is finished yet. By noon, the story had reached local news stations. By afternoon, national automotive networks were discussing the mystery vehicle. Meanwhile, across town, Victoria. Sterling sat in a conference room reviewing market projections when her chief marketing officer entered carrying a tablet. You need to see this. Victoria barely looked up. What now? The tablet displayed a major automotive publication featuring Ethan's discovery. The headline filled the screen. Victoria's smile slowly disappeared. That is impossible. Apparently, several experts disagree. Victoria read the article twice. Then a third time. For the first time since the auction, uncertainty entered her expression. Not fear. Not yet. But uncertainty. Back at the workshop, Ethan continued examining documents from the hidden compartment. One photograph revealed Daniel Mercer standing beside the vehicle. Another showed engineers gathered around blueprints. Yet one image stood out above all the others. A younger man stood smiling beside Mercer. Unlike the others, his face was instantly recognizable. Ethan froze. Sophie leaned closer. Who was that? Ethan stared at the image. Every racing fan in America knew that face. Even decades later, it remained famous. I do not believe it, he whispered. Sophie waited. Ethan finally looked up. That is Jack Lawson. Her eyes widened. The Jack Lawson? Ethan nodded. Jack Thunder Lawson. One of the greatest racing legends in American history. A man whose name appeared in museums, documentaries, and halls of fame. Yet according to every public record, Lawson had never been connected to Daniel Mercer or the Lost Prototype project. Ethan studied the photograph again. They were standing shoulder to shoulder, smiling like close friends. Which meant one thing. The official story was wrong. Somewhere out there, a racing legend knew the truth. And almost as if fate had been listening, Ethan's phone rang. An unknown number appeared on the screen. He answered cautiously. A calm older voice spoke. My name is Jack Lawson. Ethan nearly dropped the phone. The voice continued. I heard you found something that belongs to a story the world forgot. I would like to see that car myself. The next day felt strangely quiet. News outlets continued discussing the mysterious vehicle. Collectors continued sending offers. Social media continued, debating whether Ethan Walker was lucky, brilliant, or simply caught in the middle of an internet obsession. Yet inside the small workshop, none of that seemed important. There was only one thing on Ethan's mind. Jack Lawson was coming. Shortly after noon, a black SUV rolled slowly down the gravel driveway. No cameras followed. No security team appeared. No reporters crowded the property. The vehicle stopped beside the workshop, and an older man stepped out wearing jeans, work boots, and a faded racing jacket. Time had added silver to his hair and lines to his face, but nothing could diminish the quiet presence he carried. Sophie immediately recognized him from documentaries she had watched with her father. "That is really him," she whispered. Ethan nodded. Jack Lawson smiled warmly as he approached. "You must be Sophie." She smiled nervously. "Yes, sir. Your father has been causing quite a stir." Ethan laughed softly. That was not exactly the plan. Jack shook his hand firmly. The best discoveries rarely are. They entered the workshop together. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows. The old vehicle sat exactly where it had been for days, surrounded by photographs, documents, notebooks, and research materials. For a moment, Jack simply stood there. He said nothing. He did not walk closer. He did not inspect the car. He only stared. The room became unusually still. Even Sophie sensed something had changed. Then Jack slowly stepped forward. One hand reached toward the weathered fender. His fingers brushed the rust-covered surface with surprising gentleness. The expression on his face shifted. Pride, sadness, gratitude, memories. Emotions decades old seemed to return all at once. Ethan exchanged a glance with Sophie, but remained silent. Some moments deserve respect. Jack continued walking around the vehicle. His eyes lingered on details nobody else noticed. The unique vents, the handcrafted body lines, the hidden emblem. Every feature seemed familiar to him. Finally, he stopped beside the driver's side door. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Daniel." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "You knew him?" Jack smiled sadly. "Better than most people did." Sophie sat quietly while Jack pulled up a chair near the workbench. The afternoon sun illuminated the old photographs scattered across the table. For a few moments he studied them before speaking again. "The world remembers champions," he said softly. "It remembers trophies, headlines, records." He paused. "But sometimes the people who change history never receive any of those things." Ethan listened carefully. Jack picked up the photograph, showing himself standing beside Daniel Mercer. Daniel was one of the most gifted men I ever met. Sophie leaned forward. "Then why does nobody know who he was?" Jack looked at her. The sadness in his eyes deepened. "Because history does not always reward the right people." The workshop fell silent again. Outside, wind moved gently through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed across the countryside. Jack turned another photograph over. On the back, faded handwriting covered the paper. His eyes widened slightly. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it?" Jack stared at the writing. "I have not seen his handwriting in over 50 years. Carefully, he handed the photograph to Ethan. A short message had been written beneath the image. Just one sentence. Ethan read it aloud. "If anything happens to me, make sure the truth reaches the finish line." Nobody spoke. Jack slowly removed his glasses. His eyes had become glassy. "That sounds exactly like Daniel." Sophie looked confused. "What truth?" Jack took a slow breath. Then he looked directly at Ethan. "The truth is that this car never belonged in a scrapyard. It belongs in one of the most important chapters of American racing history." He paused. "And there is something else you need to know." Ethan waited. Jack's expression became serious. Daniel Mercer did not disappear from history by accident. The workshop remained quiet long after Jack Lawson spoke those words. Daniel Mercer did not disappear from history by accident. The sentence lingered in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. Sophie sat perfectly still. Ethan folded his arms and waited. Jack had spent decades carrying this story. He would tell it in his own time. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched golden light across the gravel driveway. Inside, 3 generations sat together around a forgotten piece of history. Finally, Jack leaned forward and rested both hands on the workbench. 52 years ago, this car changed everything. His eyes moved toward the vehicle. Daniel helped design it. Most people thought he was only a driver, but they were wrong. He understood engineering better than men twice his age. Every improvement, every adjustment, every innovation came from him. Ethan glanced at the documents scattered across the table. Suddenly, many of the handwritten notes made sense. Jack continued. "The prototype was faster than anything we had tested. Not because of money. Not because of a giant company. Because Daniel refused to accept limitations." Sophie smiled. "That sounds like my dad." Ethan laughed softly. Jack smiled as well. "Then your father and Daniel have something in common." For a moment, The room felt lighter. Then Jack's expression became serious again. The problem was that success creates attention, and attention attracts powerful people. He reached into the leather envelope and removed one final folded document that Ethan had not yet opened. The paper looked different from the others. Official, formal, important. Carefully, Jack unfolded it. Across the top appeared the logo of the racing organization that governed the sport during that era. Ethan leaned closer. "What is that?" Jack slid the document across the table. "The reason Daniel disappeared." Ethan read silently. Sophie's eyes widened. The document detailed a dispute over ownership of the prototype design. Several large investors had attempted to claim credit for the project after seeing its potential commercial value. Daniel refused to sign away his contribution. The project collapsed shortly afterward. Funding vanished. Public records were altered. The vehicle disappeared, and history moved on without him. Ethan looked up slowly. "They erased him." Jack nodded. "Not completely, but enough." Silence followed. It was not an angry silence. It was something heavier, the kind that arrives when truth finally reveals itself. Sophie looked toward the car. "So he never got credit." Jack's smile carried both sadness and admiration. "Not while he was alive." The words landed gently, respectfully. Ethan noticed something else inside the document. Attached to the final page was a handwritten certification bearing signatures from multiple engineers. One sentence had been underlined. He read it aloud. "Daniel Mercer is the principal creator and rightful owner of the prototype design." Jack nodded. That statement disappeared from every public archive. Ethan stared at the page, then at the car, then back at the page. After more than 50 years, the proof had survived hidden inside the very machine Daniel built. Almost as if he knew someone honest would eventually find it. Jack stood and walked slowly around the vehicle one final time. His hand rested briefly on the roof. "Do you know why I came here myself?" Ethan shook his head. Jack smiled. "Because some stories deserve witnesses." Just then, another notification appeared on Ethan's phone. A major national racing museum had published an announcement. The discovery was now being investigated officially. Historians, engineers, and collectors were requesting access. The story had become national news. Ethan showed the screen to Jack. The racing legend looked at it briefly, then nodded. "Good. Good?" Ethan asked. Jack smiled toward the old vehicle. "Because tomorrow the world stops arguing about whether this car matters." He paused. "Tomorrow they learn exactly what it is worth." The following afternoon, the National Motorsports Heritage Center hosted an emergency press event unlike anything it had seen in years. Journalists filled the auditorium. Historians occupied the front rows. Collectors traveled across the country to attend. Cameras lined every wall. On the stage sat the weathered prototype exactly as Ethan had found it, still carrying much of its rust, still wearing the scars of time, and somehow commanding more attention than the most expensive vehicles in America. Ethan stood quietly beside Sophie near the back of the room. He wore the same modest jacket he had worn to the auction. Sophie held her notebook against her chest. Neither of them seemed entirely comfortable with the attention. Jack Lawson stood at the podium. The room fell silent as he stepped forward. For decades, his voice had carried authority throughout the racing world. Today it carried something more powerful. Truth. Behind him, large screens displayed photographs recovered from the hidden compartment. Images of Daniel Mercer. Engineering sketches. Official documents. Forgotten history finally returning to the light. Jack spoke calmly. He told the story of a young engineer and driver whose contributions had been erased. He described the prototype's revolutionary design. He explained how Daniel had refused to surrender ownership of his work. Every sentence seemed to lift another layer of dust from the past. By the time he finished, many people in the audience sat completely motionless. Then the museum director approached the microphone. After reviewing the documents, consulting independent experts, and verifying the vehicle's authenticity, we officially recognize Daniel Mercer as the principal creator of one of the most important lost prototypes in American racing history. The audience erupted into applause. Not loud, celebratory applause. Respectful applause. The kind reserved for someone finally receiving what should have been theirs all along. Ethan glanced toward Sophie. She smiled. The applause continued for nearly a full minute. Then the museum director made another announcement. "We have also completed an independent valuation." The room immediately grew quiet again. Reporters raised cameras. Collectors leaned forward. Even Ethan looked surprised. The director opened a folder. Based on historical significance, rarity, provenance, and market demand, the estimated value exceeds $5 million. Audible gasps spread through the auditorium. Dozens of heads turned toward Ethan. 5 days earlier, people had laughed at him. Now nobody laughed. But the biggest surprise had not arrived yet. Jack Lawson returned to the microphone. He looked directly at Ethan. I spent my entire career collecting pieces of racing history. He paused. But some pieces matter more than others. The room became perfectly still. Jack smiled. I would like to purchase the vehicle. For $5 million. Silence followed. Complete silence. Not because people were shocked by the money. Because they understood what the offer meant. This was not merely a transaction. It was recognition. Respect. Redemption. Ethan stood frozen for a moment. Then he looked at Sophie. Her eyes filled with tears she did not try to hide. Dad, she whispered. Ethan smiled softly. The same quiet smile he had carried through every hardship. Every long night. Every insult. Every doubt. He stepped toward the stage. Cameras flashed. Reporters waited. Yet when Ethan finally spoke, his words were simple. If the car goes anywhere, it goes somewhere Daniel's story can be told. Jack nodded immediately. It will. Another silence settled across the room. A different silence this time. A peaceful one. Somewhere in the crowd, Victoria Sterling sat watching. She had arrived quietly and remained unnoticed. No speech left her lips. No excuse. No defense. Only reflection. She had laughed at a man because she saw rust. Ethan had seen history. The audience rose to its feet once more. Not for the money. Not for the headlines. But for the reminder that character sees what pride often misses. As the applause echoed through the hall, Ethan placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder and looked toward the old vehicle one final time. The forgotten story had finally reached the finish line. And for the first time in more than 50 years, the room was silent with respect.